job on our song service this morning. If you get your message notes out, we're starting a new series. We're going to call it How to Turn Setbacks into Comebacks. Because I would call this year at Westbury the year of the loss. We've lost a lot of people this year as they've transitioned from our time to God's time. We've had some setbacks in the congregation and the Spanish side. We've faced some adversity this year, and so I want to talk a little bit about what God has to say about that. Now, here's the deal. Everybody, every single one of us has problems. Every single one of us has trials and difficulties and losses and failures and mistakes and setbacks. And I mean, there are as many different setbacks as there are folks. It could be a financial setback. It could be a health setback. It could be a career setback. It could be a relational setback. You could have a setback in your marriage. You could have a setback with your boyfriend or girlfriend. You could have a setback in your plans. You could have a setback in your dreams. That we have setback after setback in life. And this series, we're going to address some of those setbacks. And we're going to look at the Bible and about how God helped people overcome each one of these kinds of common things that we experience in life. Now today, and not because of any particular order or any particular experience, today we're going to look at how to deal with a business setback, how to deal with a bankruptcy, how to deal when things don't go well career-wise. Now you're going, well, hang on a second. I don't own a business. I'm not in a business. I don't plan on having a business. Okay, well, we're going to draw some principles that you can use in your life out of a biblical story that you're going to be able to use. You're going to be able to take advantage of. I promise. Okay, and so we're going to look at some guys that were professional fishermen. They owned a business, and a business exists to earn a profit. And we're going to look at some guys who failed miserably in their business until they turned to Jesus. Okay, now I know we don't have anybody here that owns a professional fishing business, but these things are going to apply. I promise that, okay? Now, one of the things, before my father became a preacher, he didn't become a preacher till he was in his 30s. And before that, we grew up in South Florida. I was born in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and one of the things him and we did together before he became a preacher was we would go fishing, because South Florida is basically a swamp. And so the developers, when they came and developed land, they would cut these canals in there so things could drain. And it made for some pretty great fishing in there, these canals that ran through there. And so there's lots of natural habitat for that. And so, so you catch a lot of fish. Every now and then you'd have to argue with an alligator over whose fish it was. But most of the time it was very peaceful and a lot of fun. Now then we moved to Lubbock, and there wasn't much fishing in Lubbock because there's not a lot of water up there, and you got to have water to have fish. And so there wasn't a lot there. And then they moved here, and then ultimately we moved here. And remember when they bought this place up in Goodrich? You guys that went up there, and they had this lake, and we would go out and fish. And now today, if you want to sometime, come into my office, see this big fish on the wall. A big sailfish I caught when I was in Mexico in that. And as big as that fish was, oh, you should have seen the one that got away. And because let's face it, if you fish, there's always one that got away, right? In that. Now, we're not going to talk about the one that got away today, but we are going to talk about the greatest fishing story of all time. It's in Luke chapter 5. And we're going to look at the principles and the lessons that we can learn on that. That's what we're going to do in this entire series. Now, if you've ever felt discouraged about your work, if you've ever felt discouraged about your career, if you've ever felt discouraged about your business, if you've ever felt discouraged and fatigued about not getting anything accomplished, or worn out after putting your heart and your soul into something, or maybe you've even lost your job after you gave it absolutely everything you had, you picked a good day to come to church. Because none of the fish stories that you've ever heard in your life can match this one in Luke chapter 5. Now, here's some interesting things about this miracle. Because this miracle in Luke 5 is the one where Jesus actually calls the first 4 guys that he wants to help him in his ministry. This is the miracle where he calls them. Now, let me give you a little background. Because this fishing business was owned by two brothers, two sets of brothers. It was owned by Peter and Andrew, they were brothers, and James and John, they were brothers as well. And they had a fishing business up in northern Israel around this lake. Now this lake in the Bible has three different names. It's called Lake Gennesaret, it's called the Sea of Galilee, it's called the Sea of Tiberias. And it's big. It's kind of like Lake Livingston, only it's in northern Israel. And they have a business, and their business is catching fish. And that they are professionals at what they do. Now, they had been up all night the night before, fishing on the Sea of Galilee, and they caught nothing. You might say the lake was in recession. You might say that the economy of the lake was poor. All they know is that they're not making any money, and if you're going to be in business and you're not making any money, you're not going to be in business very long. And it says they had worked for 10 hours, and they were sitting there cleaning their nets, and they've got empty buckets. Now, we've got folks in here that can relate to that today. Because you went out last week and you worked hard to do whatever it is that you're trying to do to feed your family, and your buckets were empty. And here comes Jesus, and he's talking to a crowd full of folks and on the shore, and he says to these guys, excuse me, can I use one of your boats as a platform to speak from? Now let's look at the story in Luke 5 on your message notes and up here. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, with the people crowded around him and listening to the word of God, he saw at the water's edge two boats left there by fishermen who were washing their nets. Now he gets into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, okay, that's Simon Peter, and he asks him to put out a little bit from shore. Then he sat down and he taught the people from the boat, sitting in the boat. Now why did Jesus ask to borrow the boat? Well, that's speculation. Let me just speculate a little bit with you here, okay? Now, have you noticed that voices carry over water? You see, the ground absorbs voice waves. Water, voice waves tend to bounce off of it. And so it's pretty smart communication to be able to kind of pull out a little bit across from the shore and speak so more people could hear what he had to say. And so it was just smart communication. He could speak to more people from the boat. But there was a more important reason. Because he was about to call these four guys who owned this business to leave that business and follow him. And so he's going to do a miracle where he speaks their language. It is important that we learn to speak people's language. Even though we may all speak English, sometimes we speak a little different English. And so he's about to perform a miracle that involves fish to be able to tell a bunch of fishermen that he speaks their language. Look at verse 4. When Jesus had finished, he said to Simon, now launch into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Simon says, sir, we've worked hard all night and we've not caught anything. Here's what Simon would say today. He'd say, Jesus, I want you to know that we've tried what it is that you're saying. And we hadn't made the sale. We hadn't closed the deal. We haven't reached the tipping point. We've not stepped up our game. We've not signed the contract. We've not taken it to the next level. We've not been able to achieve our goals. We've worked all night long and we've not caught anything. And sometimes that happens in life, right? Sometimes you give life, sometimes you give it your best shot, and you work hard, and you work smart, and you work long, and at the end of the day, you've got nothing to show for it. Sometimes you even think you're doing what God wants you to do, and you're doing the right thing in your career, and it just doesn't pan out. Sometimes you have a setback. That's what we're going to spend the next few months talking about. In fact, this miracle today that we're talking about teaches us a whole lot about setbacks. Because I believe everybody in here is fishing for something. You may be fishing for approval. You may be fishing for somebody to love you. You may be fishing for security. You may be fishing for a husband. You may be fishing for a wife. You may be fishing for a job. But you're fishing for something. You may be fishing for a new source of income. So when these fishermen did what Jesus told them to do, in this miracle, they didn't just get the miracle, they got blessed a whole lot more than they could handle themselves. So Jesus uses Simon Peter's boat as a platform to preach the good news. And the Bible tells the rest of the story. It says this: after Jesus finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Now launch out into the deep water to let down your nets for a catch." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners, that's James and John, in the other boat to come over and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full with fish that it began to sink. Okay, there's your good fish story right there, all right? It says that they caught more fish in 10 minutes than they did in the 10 hours before that. That's how you turn a setback into a comeback. This is called the miracle of acceleration. That's where God speeds things up. So the first thing we do if we want to turn a setback into a comeback is to do what Peter, Andrew, James, and John did. And I want you to write this down, that if we want to turn a setback into a comeback, we need to give Jesus complete access to our boat. I need to give Jesus complete access to my boat. If I want to go from emptiness to abundance, if I want to go from emptiness to overflowing, I need to give Jesus complete access to my boat. Notice it says in Luke 5:3, Jesus got into one of the boats. Here's the starting point, and it's simple. You got to get Jesus in your boat. Now, I want you to notice the difference here, okay? Because it's the same lake, it's the same boat, it's the same nets, it's the same fishermen, it's the same fish. The only thing different between nothing and everything is Jesus in the boat. This is the game changer. You got to get Jesus in your boat if you want to turn a setback into a comeback. You've got to give him access to your business. So now God's with them. They're not fishing by themselves anymore. Their business has got the master in control. So the first question I have for you today is, what's your boat? Well, your boat is how you make a living. It's your means of support. Simon was a fisherman, so his boat was his business, and he gave his job to Jesus. Now, we're not talking about a salvation issue here, okay? We're not talking about salvation. You can have Jesus in your life, but not in your boat. You can have Jesus in your life, but not in your job. So to give Jesus your boat says, I'm going to dedicate my career to you, Jesus, for your use. Now, when Peter gave his job to Jesus for God to use, he got blessed with some incredible results. Now, normally we think that God makes me really great and God makes me really successful in business so that then I will serve God with my success. And in reality, it is the exact opposite. God uses my job or my lack of job, and then the success can come. All right, because there's no comeback without a setback first. Let me say that again. There is no comeback without a setback first. That the setback is part of the plan. Let me say that again. That the setback is part of the plan. That Peter's fished all night long and he's caught nothing. So how's he going to go from nothing to something? First, Peter lets Jesus use his job for a platform. The second step that they did, and we can do too, is this. I admit my efforts aren't working. I admit what I'm doing isn't working. Luke 5, chapter 4 through 5 says, when Jesus had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep waters and let down your nets. And Peter answers, here's his confession, Master, we've worked hard all night and we haven't caught anything. Now, do you realize how hard it was for Peter to say that? I mean, he's a pro. He's earning a living at fishing. And it's difficult to say, and he's done it his whole life. And you realize how difficult it is to admit that he's failing at what he's doing? Because sometimes even when you're a pro, you know what to do and you do it with all your might and still you fail. Even when you're experienced at what you do, you fish all night and you catch nothing. And here's the humbling part, because like a lot of us, Peter's identity is tied up in Peter's job. That means for Peter not to catch fish, that's like James Harden going a whole game and not scoring a basket. It's unheard of. But you know what? Sometimes our best, that's just not good enough. Sometimes you can't control the economy. Sometimes you can't control the weather. Sometimes you can't control a lot of things that affect our job. Sometimes you can't control things that affect your business or your life or your profits. Sometimes you can't control other people. You can't control disease. You can't control how you get old. And most of the major things that we deal with in life, we can't control. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to do these first two things to go from setback to comeback. We get Jesus in the boat, and then we admit our way isn't working. Now, why don't we like to admit our way isn't working? And I could go on for the next 30 minutes on these three things that I'm not going to, because there's really three reasons why we don't like to admit it's not working. Number one is pride. Number two is stubbornness. Number three is fear. But let's move on at the third step that disciples took. And that is, number these first disciples. They weren't disciples yet. They were fishermen. Number three was this: do whatever Jesus tells me to do. That means I've got to be willing to obey Jesus Christ, even when obeying Jesus Christ doesn't make sense. Look at verse 5. Jesus tells them to launch out into the deep. And Simon says, Master, we've worked hard all night. We haven't caught anything. We're empty. We've come up empty. But because you say so. All right, I want you to underline that. I want you to circle that. I want you to put stars around that, because you say so. Not because I think it's smart, not because I think it's popular, not because I think it's rational, not because I think it's reasonable, not because I can afford it, but God, I'm going to do that because you say so. Now, I want you to notice what Peter does not do. Because Peter doesn't do what most of us, Peter does not do what most of us would do. So here's what most of us would do, because as far as we know, it's really the first time he's ever had a conversation with Jesus. Because if I was Peter right there, I got to, hang on a second. What'd you say your name was? Jesus, right? Jesus, Peter. Simon, glad to meet you. Jesus, all right, very good. So you want me to, hang on a second. Jesus, hang on just a second, all right? What did you say you did for a living? Carpentry, all right. Carpentry, good thing, good stuff. Wife's looking for some new cabinets. Maybe a little later on, we can come over and measure. And stuff like that. But let me tell you something, buddy. You know wood, I know fish. Capiche? Stay in your lane. Why don't you do that? How about when I make a deal with you? How about you don't tell me how to fish, and I won't tell you how to hang cabinets? All right, let's just play it. Let's just play it like that, because how long have you fished? Oh, you've never fished, and you want me to do that? Oh, I'll tell you what. Let's just do what the wise guy says. How about that? Hang on. Peter doesn't argue with him. Peter doesn't hesitate. When Jesus says launch out, Peter just does. Oh, and here we get to the part of the lesson where I get personal, and I'm sorry. No, I'm not. What's God told you to do that you haven't? What's God told you to do that you're not? I want you to notice that the calling of Peter involves three things. Number one, when, what, and where. First, Jesus says launch out, and the when. Launch out now. Not in 30 minutes, not next year. Launch out now. By the way, launch out always means take a risk. Launching out is always risky, and God's always going to force us to take a risk. Why? Because there's no faith without risk. And without faith, it's impossible to please God. So he says now. And then he says what? He says, I want you to let down your nets. And then he says where? He says in the deep water. Now, why does God tell Peter to launch out into the deep water? Well, because God knows that's where the big fish are. A sad fact of reality is that most of us, we prefer to live our life in the shallow end. We prefer to live our life where the storms don't get. We prefer to get our toes wet, just deep enough for Jesus to bug us and not bless us. We don't ever get in over our heads. We come to church, we paddle around in the shallow end, we splash around, we catch a few minnows, we get our feet wet, and we miss God's best. As your preacher, I've thought a lot about this, and I believe it's because it's safer in the shallow end. Because there are no big waves on the shallow end, and our boat's not going to get rocked in the shallow end, and it's not risky in the shallow end. But we miss some things like the greatest blessings God could ever give us. And so we settle. and this nice, comfortable zone where we want God to bless our plans. Whoa. They didn't sell the biggest catch. They're set up for retirement. They could have said this was it. This was the big. All of us are looking for that one big deal, that one big sale, that one big thing, that one big retirement, that one big cash in. All of us are looking for that one lottery ticket that's going to set us up for life. And it said they got it, and they pulled their boats up onto the shore and turned around and left it. They didn't clean them. They didn't sell them. They just followed Jesus. You see, this is what I want you to get. When you want to move from setback to comeback, they were willing to follow Jesus and leave that blessing behind because they were more interested in the blesser than they were the blessing. You know, they were going to forget the blessing. We tend to forget the blessings because the blessing wasn't going to last forever. But they knew if they followed the guy who did it, there would be plenty more where that came from. So can you walk away from the biggest catch of your life, the biggest deal of your life? Can you walk away from the stock options? Can you walk away from the sale? Can you walk away from the salary and the benefits? And you can if you're walking next to the blesser, because when you're walking next to the blesser, there's plenty more where that came from. So my point is this from Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They didn't get so obsessed with the blessing that they forgot about the relationship with the blesser. And that's who I want to introduce you to today. That's how you turn a setback into a comeback. They knew following Jesus Christ was the secret to everything else. You're ready for the comeback. And it starts by following the blesser. And you follow the blesser by being a part of the blesser's family. That trip to the blesser starts with making the blesser your brother, being baptized into Jesus Christ. You walk out of here wearing the name Christian. It means that you're a brother of the same guy who blessed Peter, Andrew, James, and John on the lake of Gennesaret all those years ago and convinced them in one miracle that he was worth following. And today, in February of 2019, he is still worth following. If you'll answer this invitation, come back. You may have gotten burned somewhere by the church or the church's people. Hey, listen, God's great. Sometimes his kids could use a little work. Don't let that stop you from being a follower of Jesus Christ. Come back or be a part of this family here. We'd love to have you as we follow the blesser for the rest of our lives. There's your invitation. There's your chance to meet the blesser. Don't let it go past you today while we stand and while we sing.